Hey my loves, welcome back to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking in. If this is your first time here, you are welcome. Please do not forget to click on your subscribe button. Your subscribe button is just below this video. Please subscribe to my channel. After subscribing, I'm also going to beg you to click on your bell notification. Your bell notification is just beside the subscribe button and you'll be able to see it after you might have subscribed. Thank you so much to all my amazing subscribers. You guys are the best. God bless you.
I've never been exposed like this before.
Today's video, we are going to dig deep into Africa and everything about Africa and African history. How much do you know about our history? If you are an African, this video is for you. Like, you need to watch every details about this video. A time has passed when someone will come out and say, I am a Ghanaian, I'm a Nigerian, I'm a Togolese. Season is a season of, hey, I am an African, and there are a lot of things you need to know. You need to know your history. This is very important. If you're an African and you don't know much about your history, I'm not sure it's a good one. I think with the happenings around the world, especially what is happening currently in the United States, African has come to embrace our culture and also embrace who we are. A lot has happened in the past few weeks and some hidden truths are also out. Okay, I'll allow you to watch this video. Please do not forget to like and share so that others will watch as well.
The same people who have the audacity to tell us that we are poor countries, they are taking trillions out of Africa every year. And what is the African doing? Like an obedient, programmed black man, we just give in. We know the facts, but we just do nothing about it.
Youth of Africa, pay attention to this. I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to say to you today. Now, after the independence of African nations from the shackles of colonialism, Africans decided to form the United States of Africa, but the former colonial masters, for the purpose of keeping the continent divided, convinced some African leaders to settle for a mere organization in the year 1963. Before the formation of the organization, the newly independent African countries were grouped into three different groups: the Casablanca, the Moravia, and the Brazzaville. These groups had different ideology on how independent African countries can come together in unity. Now, the Casablanca bloc or the Casablanca group was a radical group that agitated for the United States of Africa with a single language and government governing the entire Africa. Unfortunately, this was not accepted by many African leaders who feared that they might not acquire political power after they had struggled tirelessly for their African countries to gain political freedom from colonial rule. They kicked against the idea and settled for the formation of the Organization of African Unity, which is OAU, which is today referred to as African Union, AU. This was exactly what the former colonial masters wanted. The colonial masters lobbied the new African leaders to settle for OAU and not to settle for one government in Africa. This decision was one of the major factors that has kept Africans completely disunited, especially at the international level. The likes of late Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and late Gaddafi of Libya have bitterly buttressed the benefits in Ethiopia of having a united Africa under one political umbrella. But the newly independent African leaders were convinced to embrace statehood and rule as presidents in their African countries. Little did they know that this is mainly for the economic interest of their former colonial masters, who still want African countries to be economically and politically colonized and divided. The fact is that if African nations are under one African government with a single and generally accepted lingua franca like Swahili, the resources of Africa will be utilized for the political and economic development of the African continent. The failure to form a united Africa has led to the disunity among African leaders in the international political atmosphere. African leaders who are now presidents in their African countries are used by their former colonial masters for the underdevelopment of Africa. because of loans they get from World Bank and IMF. The main aim for the formation of the OAU was to bring African nations together and resolve the issues within the continent. But it is disheartening to inform you that this is the most useless international organization as long as the history of Africa is concerned. A failure that is characterized by irrational leaders who are controlled by their creditors in the World Bank and IMF. African leaders in the United Nations are meaningless when they speak at the international level. They only go there to take pictures with their former colonial masters. They go there to take pictures with white people. They go there to show the Americans and the English people that they can speak good English. Meanwhile, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, they speak in their local dialect at international level. We only know how to speak good English, but we cannot provide food and good governance for our teeming population in Africa. It is very deplorable and despicable that the continent that once gave the world civilization is now a barbarian.
Truth is plain to see. If you want freedom, take pride in your country. If you want democracy, hold on to your sovereignty. And if you want peace, love your nation. Wise leaders always put the good of their own people and their own country first. The future does not belong to globalists. The future belongs to patriots. The future belongs to sovereign and independent nations who protect their citizens, respect their neighbors, and honor the differences that make each country special and unique.
The enemies of Africa do not always get along, but when it comes to exploiting the continent, they act as one and attack together. And someone once said to me, I don't think any other groups are better than us, but I just think we won't do anything together. Look, we even made it difficult for fellow Africans to travel within Africa, whether it's due to the high cost of flight or the stringent visa requirements. Meanwhile, foreigners from entirely different continents can arrive at many of our airports and be granted visa-free or receive visa on arrival. I mean, we know the root causes, the effects, and the consequences of these issues, but why are we not addressing these burning issues with a sense of emergency?
I am not African because I was born in Africa, but because Africa was born in me. Action without thought is empty. Thought without action is blind. It is clear that we must find an African solution to our problems, and that this can only be found in African unity. Divided, we are weak. United, Africa will become one of the greatest forces for good in the world. Those who would judge us merely by the heights we have achieved would do well to remember the depths from which we started. Africa is a paradox which illustrates and highlights neo-colonialism. Her earth is rich, yet the products that come from above and below the soil continue to enrich not Africans predominantly, but groups and individuals who operate to Africa's impoverishment. The independence of Ghana is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent. We have awakened. We will not sleep anymore.
Pan-Africanism is not about a cultural unity of the African continent. It is a pragmatic, political and economic unity that should be made by the African people in order to ensure our collective liberation from imperialism, neocolonialism and our useless ruling class. That's what it is. I'm seeing way too many people who say, oh, there's a united African culture, and are trying to push this view that Africans should have a common language or we have some common cultural heritage, but all of that is rubbish. The fight for Pan-Africanism does not involve the fight to create some magical pseudo Pan-African culture that does not exist. That will just lead to cultural genocide and more tribalism. If you wake up one morning and you go to Nigeria, start telling Yoruba people that need to learn Swahili, or you start telling Zulu people that need to learn Swahili and abandon their language, it's not going to end well. That's just a silly program. Pan-Africanism should be focusing on bringing the African people together along class lines. The African people are all oppressed regardless of tribe, regardless of language, regardless of culture. It is that class position that matters, and that's what will unite the people against imperialism, against colonialism, and against capitalism especially. Any attempt at building Pan-Africanism along cultural lines is dead on arrival.
In my lifetime, Africa will become a superpower in wealth. Africa has the resources, the ability and the people to grow into an economic superpower. It is the richest continent already in terms of natural resources. 30% of the world's cobalt, diamonds, gold and iron are in Africa. Africa also has huge wealth in oil. Nigeria produces more than 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. On the global market, one barrel is worth around $52. You can do the maths, and unlike many countries in the West, including Britain, Africa is not saddled with debt. The British debt is 87% of the British GDP, while the African debt is only 9% of their GDP. All but 2 countries in Africa could pay off their debt within 1 year. So the potential is already there, and the growth is already beginning.
What is the Africa we want? So we say we want an Africa that is free of violent conflict and war. What leadership do you produce to get that result? We want an Africa that is free from poverty. What kind of leadership do you need to create to end that poverty? We want an Africa that is free of, that is driven by women's emancipation. Where is this leadership? How do you create it? We want an Africa that is free of corruption. How do you produce this leadership that is not corrupt? Now, these are the questions I took to answer these practical things that President Kagame was talking about. And it's not an easy question to answer. But I think critically, and we were discussing this thing yesterday, critically, we need a critical self-assessment of ourselves as Africans.
Did you know that most of the land in Namibia is still owned by foreigners, and Germans in particular? The beautiful landscape and the surrounding mountains that you see here are all part of a 32,000 hectare big farm owned by a single German family. That is the size of Munich or Disneyland in Orlando, Florida, and this is just one single farm out of many you'll find across the country. Starting from the Namibian-South African border up to Namibia's capital Windhoek, you will see that the land left and right is fenced. These are all private farms. During my travels through Southern Africa, I learned that the descendants of the settlers who own most of the farms have inherited so much wealth, they have not even spent the money their grandfathers have left behind. I always admired Africans for being able to forgive what has been done to them during slavery and colonialism, for being the most welcoming countries in the world, even embracing descendants of colonizers as part of their nation. But witnessing with my own eyes that their country's independence has not ended the dispossession of their land, and racist views some settlers still carry on in the present towards them, left me with so many questions, especially with the question, are we maybe too forgiving? What do you think? Let me know in the comments.
I no longer use the term democracy much, because I think it misrepresents what we want. I think the Westerners came and told us that democracy means, 1, you must have multi-party politics. 2, you must have periodic elections. I now use the word governance more. Look at your typical post-colonial African state. They are multi-ethnic. And because they are multi-ethnic, there are certain things and considerations that you put into account that would not make sense in a mono-ethnic country such as Denmark. Take, for example, a country like South Sudan. It has 5 vice presidents. It doesn't make sense on the face of it. But in order to preserve the nation, that which does not make sense makes sense in that environment.
We want one Africa, one president, one parliament, one military command center, one currency that will be based on our minerals as the African continent. Ourselves and Zimbabwe alone account for not less than 85% of the world platinum. Imagine we become one thing and we hold our platinum and say we're determining the price now, like they do with the oil, those who have the oils, the Arabs and all of that. Although their oil is based on dollar, but they are benefiting out of it, and they've developed their countries based on their natural resources. So we need one Africa, and we must speak in one voice. That's how the Security Council is going to respect us. That's how China is going to respect us. How can Swaziland go and negotiate with China and say we are equal to China? Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, on the base of what? Size matters in politics, and the more we come together, the more the world will respect us. That structure has been there for quite some time, and the world has evolved over a period of time. And if that is the case, to have these guys who are permanent members of the Security Council because of what happened post the World War II, But there's been this huge development which include decolonization of Africa and doing away with apartheid and liberation of African countries. So when that Security Council was formed in that way, we were under these people who are in the Security Council. Now we are on our own. Why can't we get ourselves a permanent seat in the Security Council? But no one must have the veto powers. It must be a decision of the majority. That's how democracy works.
The Organization of African Union created on May 25th, 1963 in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, was part of an effort to circumvent efforts by Kwame Nkrumah to build a single union of African states. And instead we come up with an Organization of African Union that codified the colonial borders that were created by Europe in 1884 and 85. We have to be able to break out of this, but it's going to take revolution in order to do this. African revolution in order to do this. African revolution that will destroy imperialism and the world economy that's responsible for the growing immiseration of the masses of people around the world. Uhuru.
This African Union now. There is no time to waste. We must unite or we perish.
Let us also forget that colonialism and imperialism may come to us yet in a different guise, not necessarily from Europe. We must elect ourselves to be able to recognize this when it rears its head and prepare ourselves. This mid-20th century is Africa's. This decade is the decade of African independence. Forward then to independence. To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
What is Pan-Africanism? Pan-Africanism is grounded in the belief that all African descendants, whether inside or outside the continent, are one nation, due to sharing an interconnected history. It was a political movement and an ideology that was very popular during the 20s, so when colonialism was still flourishing. Du Bois, Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey, and Malcolm X were some of the leading characters who wanted to create a counter-view against the Eurocentric view of black people at that time. What forms of activisms do we find today? On the continent, in Senegal, Binta Sarr would be a great example. She founded the NGO Aprofis, which focuses on women's rights in 35 villages. They set up speaking and listening spaces for women who were victims of violence, but also offered reading and writing courses, as well as agricultural programs to ensure food security. Binta Sarr is also part of Africans Rising, which is a pan-African movement of people working for justice, peace, and dignity on the continent, but also in the diaspora.
Did you learn something? Would you want more of this kind of videos? To be honest, Africa has always been a target. I hope our leaders will learn. Thank you so much for watching. See you on my next one. I love you. Bye. I feel it